Hello everyone, this is Dr. Lyons again, and what we're going to be talking about in this particular chapter, or in this particular part of the chapter, is the last two groups of things that don't have backbones. So that is the last two types of invertebrates. So we're going to talk about what are known as the echinoderms, and we'll talk about what are known as the chordates. Okay? And what you see in this picture, this is a type of echinoderm. This is what's known as a crinoid. So this is something that lives on coral reefs in the Pacific Ocean. So what we're going to be getting into today is these last two groups. So the echinoderms and the chordates. We're going to skip the hemichordates and just go straight from the echinoderms to the chordates. So first let's talk about the echinoderms. So these are things that are in the phylum Echinodermata. And it includes all of these various things, right? So it includes sea stars, urchins, brittle stars, sea cucumbers, sand dollars, and these crinoid things that you probably haven't heard of before. So what makes an echinoderm very different from the other types of invertebrates we talked about is that they have a 5-part radial symmetry. So you already know all about radial symmetry versus bilateral symmetry. In the case of echinoderms, it's 5-parted, which you can see that in the case of like a sea star, it's got 5 arms. The case of the sand dollar, you see it's got 5 little protrusions here. In the case with this brittle star, you see 5 arms. So they have 5-part symmetry. However, where they are very different from the others is that they're actually bilateral as juveniles. So when they're very small larvae, they actually have 2 sides. They're actually bilateral. So if you look at this urchin larvae up here, you can see it's got a left side and it's got a right side. So it is very much a bilateral organism. But this urchin will grow up to something like this that has radial symmetry. So they undergo a very major metamorphosis where they change from being bilateral into being radial. Another thing that makes echinoderms unique amongst the other animals is that they have something known as a water vascular system that uses these things called tube feet for getting around. And how this system kind of works is that there's a series of tubes of water that go throughout their bodies. And by pushing around water inside of those tubes, it makes these little tube feet, these little kind of suction cup things kind of stick out of them. And by moving around those different tube feet, that's how they actually move. That's how they actually slowly move over the sea floor and grab things and such. So hundreds and hundreds of these tiny little tube feet are controlled by this water vascular system that they have, that they use for moving around. So they have a very different type of movement from any other animal that we've talked about, right? Whereas most animals, say like arthropods, they have legs and they use that for kind of moving around. Or a lot of animals will swim in some way or another. Whereas these things, they use these tiny little suction cups for moving around over the sea floor. Another thing that makes them kind of different from the others is that they don't have true gills like a lot of the other animals do. So we talked about like crabs and lobsters and squid and bivalves and all those things, they all have gills. Whereas these things don't. Essentially their entire surface, their skin is actually what their gills are. So that makes them very different from other organisms or the other animals. So they don't have a centralized nervous system, which is perhaps why my namesake, Patrick the starfish, might be why he's not the smartest character on Bikini Bottom, because they don't have an actual centralized brain. They do have nerves throughout their bodies, but they don't have a central brain. What kind of protects them is that they have a hardened endoskeleton. So the prefix endo, that refers to things that are underneath. So the outer surface of a echinoderm is soft, and underneath it there's a hard set of plates that are underneath it. One thing that echinoderms are kind of known for is their ability to regenerate. So they can regenerate in ways that we definitely cannot. And you can kind of see this in this picture. So what you can see here, is a sea star that has one really big arm and 4 tiny little arms. So essentially what happened here is that a larger sea star lost its arm. For whatever reason, that arm came off. And then that arm essentially grew a whole new sea star attached to it. And that large sea star that lost this arm has now regrown that arm that was missing. So now there are essentially two sea stars that are clones of each other because each has regenerated the parts that went missing to it. So let's talk about some of the different types of echinoderms. So the first one I want to talk about are the Seastars. So like the others, they move around with tube feet. They have a central disc kind of in the middle, and all of the arms, attached to that. Most Seastars have 5 arms, but there are some that actually have more than that. But typically they come in multiples of 5 or pretty close to a multiple of 5. With these things, because their arms are pretty wide, they do contain organs in them. So they actually contain parts of their digestive tract inside of their arms. And all of the Seastars are carnivores. In fact, some of them are pretty voracious carnivores. The Seastars that we have on our coastline in California, the most common one, Pisaster, is a consumer of mussels. And what they will do is they will actually use their really strong tube feet in order to just rip mussels open. They'll just pry the shells open. And then they do something really interesting is in that they spit up their whole set of intestines and stomach into the mussel. They essentially spit up their entire digestive tract onto the mussel and dissolve the mussel outside of their bodies. So what that would look like if we did that would be, say you go to a restaurant, you get your plate of food in front of you and you would just, vomit your entire digestive tract onto your plate. You would dissolve all that food on your plate, and then you would suck your digestive tract back up into your mouth. So pretty gross. That's obviously not how we feed, or at least that's not how you're supposed to eat things. But for Seastars, that's just what. The next group I wanted to talk about are what are known as the Brittle Stars. The scientific name for them is the class Ophiuridae. And these are pretty similar to the regular Seastars, except that they have these really thin little arms that are often covered in spines. And so because those arms are really thin, they don't have any organs that are out in them. So they don't have any bit of their digestive tract out inside of their arms, unlike the regular Seastars do. And with these things, they have tube feet, but the tube feet don't actually have suckers on them. And the reason for that is that they don't really need them. A sea star that like Pisaster, what we find here in California, needs those tube feet in order to pry open mussels. Whereas brittle stars don't do that. They mostly eat like small dead stuff off of the seafloor. So that they tend to be either deposit feeders or they eat very, very small animals that they don't really need tube feed in order to manipulate. A brittle star. I want to talk a little bit about the sea urchins and the sand dollars, which are both of the class Echinoideae. And what makes these kind of different from the others is that they tend to be very spiny, whereas a lot of the other echinoderms are not. Right? So I think you all know that sea urchins tend to be pretty spiny. Sand dollars do have spines, but they tend to be pretty small. Inside of each of these urchins, they do have rigid plates underneath them, which is why they have this structure. And so this is what's called a test inside of a sea urchin. Something that makes them different from the others is that they have tube feet, not just on the bottom, but actually on the top as well. And you can see that in this picture, right? So you see all these tube feet are extending out from the sides, and there's some coming out from the top too. So they don't just have tube feet on the bottom, they have tube feet on the top, which means that they can use those to manipulate things that are not just above them, but also below them. How they tend to feed themselves is by scraping stuff off the sea floor or by eating algae. So urchins tend to be really, really voracious consumers of algae. And later on when we talk about kelp forests, we'll discuss the issue that urchins cause for kelp. So one thing that some urchins do that is kind of funny is that some of them wear hats. Perhaps some might even be Dodgers fans, maybe they wear them. Not really, but what they do do is they cover themselves with stuff that they can find on the seafloor. So I don't know, maybe if one found a daughter's hat, maybe you would do that, but I've never actually seen that myself. But you can see this urchin is covered with like an old like plastic razor and like some like rocks off of the seafloor. And what they do with that stuff is it's a protection. So sea urchins oftentimes live in very shallow areas, like in the intertidal, and too much exposure to UV light can be harmful to them. So what they actually are doing, like what this sea urchin is doing right here, is it's kind of giving itself a little shade, right? So it's protecting itself from the harmful rays of UV. And because they have these tube feet that are on the top, they can actually do that. They can actually manipulate those objects onto the top of them. So those are the sea urchins. Okay, there are the sea cucumbers, the class Holothuridae. So these are, when you look at these, they look quite a bit different from the others because they look actually quite a bit more bilateral. But in fact, if you look on the inside, that they are, their inner parts are kind of radial. So these things are worm-like, of course, as you can see, and they tend to have all of their tube feet concentrated on one side of their body. So the tube feet are all on the bottom, and they use that obviously for moving around. So even though, like I was saying, even though they look bilateral on the outside, internally they are radial, so that they have 5-part symmetry on the inside. These are kind of like the Roombas of the seafloor. So they move around over the seafloor very slowly and they deposit feed, meaning that they eat small bits of debris off the bottom, like small dead things essentially. So these are the animals that don't have a 5-second rule, right? If it's on the seafloor, it doesn't matter if it's been there for more than 5 seconds, they still eat it. So that's them. One thing that they do that is kind of interesting is it can eviscerate themselves. So we kind of talked about this with the Seastars. So Seastars will spit out part of their digestive tract in order to dissolve food outside of their body. These will do the same thing, but when they do it, it tends more to be a defense mechanism. So if they get scared by something, they'll spit up their internal organs. So imagine a scenario where you're in a rough part of town. Somebody comes up to you and asks for all of your money. If you were to spit up all of your internal organs, like your lungs and your heart and your stomach on the ground, then that person probably would just walk away. They probably wouldn't bother you anymore. And that's kind of what sea cucumbers do. When they get disturbed, they spit up their organs. I can only assume that it really confuses any predator to see that happen. And then they just kind of slow away really slowly and regrow all of their internal organs, right? So whereas you wouldn't be able to spit up your internal organs and then regrow them, sea cucumbers are able to do so. Okay, the last type of echinoderm that I want to talk about are the crinoids, which are in what are known as the class Crinoideae. So these feed in a completely different way from the other types of echinoderms. Right, the other ones we talked about were carnivores in the case of Seastars, deposit feeders in the case of brittle stars and sea urchins, herbivores in the case of sea urchins. But these things are passive suspension feeders. And so what that means is they wait for small particles that are in the water to drift up to them. Right? So small particles of food, when they drift up to them, they capture them and eat them. So for instance, this crinoid right here, this was one that I found in the Caribbean when I was diving. It has these feather-like things that are kind of sticking out, and those are kind of like a little net. And any food that kind of drifts by will get caught on the net and then moved into the mouth, which is in the center there. So they suspension feed passively. And these tend to be pretty rare to find. They tend to be in more deep water, but in some places you do find them on shallow reefs. In particular, one can find them in a lot of coral reefs, such as where I took this picture was in a coral reef. If you were to actually touch the feathery parts of this crinoid, you would feel that it's really sticky. And that's because they have this mucus net over all of their surface which allows them to capture that food. So that's how they actually feed. Crinoids, I think, are particularly beautiful animals that don't have backbones, right? So they can come in pretty colors like sometimes they come in these beautiful black and white stripes like this. Sometimes they're just kind of like a kind of a interesting hue. Yeah, they're really pretty. Okay, so the last group that we're going to talk about are the chordates. So these are the things that include us, like include things like the sea turtle that have backbones, but also include some things that don't have backbones, which we'll discuss here. So the chordates, which is the phylum Chordata, it includes vertebrates, so things like us that have a backbone, and it includes two groups of invertebrates, things that don't have backbones. One of which we're going to discuss here. The other one we're not going to bother with because they're pretty rare in the ocean, really. And so what makes a chordate is it has gill slits. So all chordates either have gill slits or they have ancestors that have gill slits. That's what makes them different from the other types of animals. And by gill slits, I mean a part of the body that has basically holes in it that have access to the gills, to where one would breathe from. Obviously, we don't have this as adults, but when we're kind of developing, we have things that are kind of like gill slits. And if you look at our ancestors, things like fishes, they obviously have gill slits. So let's talk about the tunicates, which are the one group of invertebrate chordates that I want to discuss. So this is known as the subphylum Urochordata. And what you're looking at here is an organism that has a larva that looks like a tadpole. And so this tadpole larva, it has gill slits and it has the characteristics of chordates. However, when you look at the adult, this is what an adult looks like. It actually doesn't have chordate characteristics. It's lacking those. So these are kind of, they're kind of on the fence of being chordates. Because when they're juveniles, they do have the characteristics that make them a chordate, but when they're adults, they don't have those characteristics. Which is kind of confusing because it's just a confusing thing. But it's also confusing when you consider the fact that this is the phylum that we are a part of, right? We are within the phylum Chordata. So it's kind of amazing to me, at least, that this mushy looking shit here, that this is essentially a close relative of ours, right? This is more closely related to us than, say, crabs or worms or crabs or octopi. This is actually a close relative of ours. So there's a good lesson in that, be nice to mushy stuff because it might actually be your cousin. So these are what we generally call sea squirts. If you were to press down on this, water would go squirting out. And how these things feed is by filter feeding. So these things, it has tiny little holes in it that sucks in water. That water then goes over its gills, which it uses to remove particles from the water that it can feed on, and then it squirts out clean water. And you can see that a little bit here. This is a different type of tunicate. These are much prettier than the mushy ones that you saw in that last picture. But you can see with each of these, there's a big hole and a small hole and a big hole and a small hole. So they suck in water into that big hole. That water then goes over the gills to breathe and to feed on small particles in the water. And then that clean water is spit out this other hole. Okay, so that's all I've got to say about the echinoderms in the chordates. So in the next chapter, we're going to move on to talking about things that do have backbones.